All right. Now, in this war, there were a couple of things that came about, and so there's a couple of really interesting things. Um, in the Spanish-American War, everybody seemed to be into it. Maybe not the anti-imperialist per se, but in this war, World War One, we see a lot more opposition than maybe we have. And so the idea of the United States is that if we could quell that, if we could stop that, things would be there. Now, the first thing is women are still campaigning for the right to vote. They get it at the end of the war in 1919, but they did start what is called the Women's Peace Party. And notice here they're marching. It says, "Real patriots keep cool." So they're using their maybe lack of the right to vote to kind of try to quell things down to make it easier. Now, here's where it gets interesting. There were a couple of acts that were actually made earlier on called the Espionage and Sedition Act. And these were made during American Revolution. The idea was to keep spies down, etc. They reemerge in the war here, and so we're going to talk about them. Now, when I say the word espionage, what I want you to think about is James Bond. He's a spy. That's what the art of spying is called, espionage, okay? So, what did it do in espionage? Now notice he's spies are listening, don't be a spy. Under the Espionage Act, you actually got federal jail time for being a spy. They made punishments for being a spy. So that's the first thing. We have to make spying illegal. And yes, there were spies here. Our spies were over there. That's what happens in war, right? Now the next thing is they embellished on it. In 1918, they came out with they were going to go back to it, called the Sedition Act. Now, what is sedition? Sedition is treasonous talk. And so here we have talk. You can't even talk about something in the war. Can't be critical of it. And this is weaving a dangerous web, no pun intended, I guess. So don't talk. The web is spun for you with invisible threads. Keep out of it. Help to destroy it. Stop. Think. Ask yourself, is what you might about to say might help the enemy, because spies are listening. So under the Sedition Act, we're actually going to try to curb free speech during a time of war. Here's another one right here, right? Quiet. Criticism of society is not free speech. Here's another one. We have pledge allegiance and silence about the war. And lastly, here's something that's really interesting. We have the Sedition Bill, and we have free speech, free press, honest opinion, and the sedition snake is about to eat these poor little children. So a lot of people maybe were in support of it, but the general mentality was loose lips might sink ships. And so in this whole thing, we don't want anything going on. Now, what happens here? Our friend Eugene V. Debs, the same one who started the Socialist Party of America, he is there. He becomes a very loud, outspoken man about this. He actually ran for president, 1912, 1916. He ran for president many times. He's actually jailed at one point for stepping on the grass, and so he's very critical of the government at this time, thinks that socialism is the way to go, and he pops up on the scene because he supports the next man we're about to talk about. He says what the next man did was entirely right within this purpose, and there's nothing wrong with it. His name was Charles Schenck. And so here's Charles Schenck, I guess it's the best way to put it. Charles Schenck is a member of the Communist Party of America, and he distributes leaflets. And in your packet for World War I have the leaflet, and there's something you do with it. So he distributes a leaflet urging people to resist the draft. He is jailed, and he fights his jail time all the way to the Supreme Court. And there's a monumental court case here, and here's where the part where the ears should perk up and you should really pay attention. The court case is called Schenck versus the United States. He sues the United States about free speech. And so what I really want you to understand here is, can you place restrictions on free speech, first off? And which is more important, personal freedoms, like free speech, or national security, keeping spies out? All of this is left to the Supreme Court, and ultimately it falls on Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Nice mustache, right? I mean, that must take some time to twist that. Anyway, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes decides that things that might be said in time of peace cannot be tolerated so long as men fight. And he gives a good analogy. he gives the analogy of shouting fire, not gunfire, but like fire, arson, etc., in a crowded theater. He said if the theater was crowded and somebody just went up there and said, "Hey, fire!" It wouldn't be tolerated because people would get hurt. And so that's what he said Charles Schenck essentially did. He caused a disruption in a very volatile or very uneasy time, and so for that reason his free speech should be curtailed, he should be held accountable, and they did this. And so this is the first, but definitely not the last, where we said that national security is more important than personal freedoms. Now, the kicker for this, if you will, is called the clear and present danger concept. Under clear and present danger, as Mr. Wendell Holmes put it, he basically has to say, with the intent, what was the man's intent of this leaflet? Is it clear? Mr. Holmes said, yes, distributing, telling them not to go on the draft, and this would affect our boys at home. Is it present? Is it something that he's wanting to happen now? Well, yes, he's doing that. So for those two reasons, he kind of ties it to the Constitution and says that this is there, all right? Monumental thing. Hopefully we got that, all right? Now the next man, George Creel, is put in charge of an organization called the CPI. CPI stands Committee on Public Information. He is the head propaganda guy, okay? Basically, he's going to produce propaganda, much like this one. Notice here we have embarked on the idea of King Kong with the woman, right? The man brute. He's got the Prussian military helmet there, and he is bringing over a culture stick, which he is basically using to rip stuff out. And so you have to destroy him. How do you do it? Enlist. Very impactful here. People have seen King Kong, heard of it, etc. Notice he's on the coast of America. He's coming to you. So that's important. Now, his group of people he put in charge of it, they were called 4 Minutemen. Now, why Minutemen going this? This is drawing back to the American Revolution. The Minutemen kind of where the British are coming, you know, etc. So 4 Minutemen, they would go and hold town meetings, and their talks were exactly 4 minutes long. They would present some type of propaganda, and the propaganda would be tied to buying a Liberty loan, enlisting in the Army, backing up one of the organizations. And there's a plethora, a whole bunch of things where this could have gone. All right, and so that is the mentality of George Creel, to use these 4 Minutemen to drum up, to get support for the war. Now, the last thing we'll talk about here is how Wilson actually decides he wants to end the war and why that is a problem. And we'll come back to that later on.